He emptied our joint account, bought a new house with our money, and then sent me a text message that would change everything. But what he didn't know was that I had a secret, and it was about to turn the tables. It was a normal Tuesday, or at least it seemed that way at first. I was in the middle of organizing my studio when I saw the notification pop up on my phone. Your husband has purchased a new property. I read it twice, then a third time, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something that made sense. But they didn't. Mark had done it. He'd bought a house, with our joint funds, without even a conversation. I couldn't breathe for a moment. The numbness crept in, then the anger. But I didn't let it show. My hands didn't shake. I didn't cry. Instead, I stood there, staring at the phone, thinking about everything that had led up to this. Mark's sudden obsession with money, the random trips he'd taken without telling me, the way his paycheck seemed to vanish faster than it ever should, the late nights at work, the private texts and password changes, his attempts to brush it all off as nothing, silly insecurities, he'd say. But now, here it was. Proof that the silence between us had been anything but. This wasn't just a random decision, it was deliberate, cold, and calculated. He'd used the money we shared for years, the money that was supposed to support our life together, to buy something for himself. I should have expected it, I thought. I'd seen the signs. But seeing it written down, in black and white, was different. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about control. He wanted to take everything, including the life I'd built, and make it all about him. The phone buzzed again. Check your email, the message read. I clicked into my inbox. There it was, a confirmation for the house he had just purchased. The property was stunning, a place that screamed new beginnings for someone who didn't need a new beginning. It was the perfect place for him to start fresh, with someone else, without me. I could almost see him now, already picturing himself in that house, claiming it as his success, laughing at my confusion. But that wasn't what would happen. He had no idea what was coming. I closed the email. I didn't need to read more. I had everything I needed in my hands. My next move was already clear. But before I did anything, I needed to remember this moment, to lock it away as fuel for what was about to come. I wasn't just going to react to this. I wasn't going to beg or plead. I would beat him at his own game. I smiled to myself as I locked my phone and set it down. I had a plan. It would be the last thing he ever underestimated about me. I wasn't just going to take this lying down. I'd been watching him, and now I was ready to play my part. And Mark had no idea what that meant yet. The hours dragged on, but I didn't rush. I knew what I had to do, and there was no need to act out of panic. Instead, I methodically put together a few things at my shop. A fresh batch of orders had come in, and there was inventory to unpack. But my mind wasn't on the work. I had a plan, and Mark was about to learn how far I'd gone to protect myself. I picked up my phone again, scrolling through his last few texts, each one more dismissive than the last. I'm buying a house. It's done. We both need this fresh start. Fresh start? For who? Him or for me? The reality was, this wasn't about a fresh start. It was about him having control over what he thought was his. But he had no idea what was coming. I locked my phone and walked into the back office, grabbing my folder from the safe. Inside was every transaction I'd carefully documented over the past few months. Receipts, account statements, phone records, the little signs I'd collected, each piece pointing to his financial mismanagement, his selfishness. 3 months ago, I'd made a decision. I knew something wasn't right, and I was going to protect what was mine. So I opened a separate bank account at another bank, one he didn't even know about. It wasn't just about hiding assets. It was about making sure that no matter what happened, my business and my personal savings would remain intact. I pulled out the documents, made sure everything was in order. Then I pulled up my lawyer's contact information. I'd spoken to her months ago, when the signs first became clear. I hesitated for only a moment before pressing call. Claire? My lawyer's voice came through, calm and reassuring. You're ready, aren't you? I nodded to myself, even though she couldn't see it. Yes. He bought a house with our joint funds. I need you to start the process. Now. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. We'd already discussed the strategy. I'd been preparing for this moment for longer than Mark had realized. Leave it to me, she said. We'll move quickly. I hung up, feeling a wave of calm wash over me. I had already taken the first step. There was no turning back now. As I started organizing my files, Mark's texts kept coming in. Each one more arrogant, more self-assured. I'll be out of the house by next week. I'll send for my stuff later. You'll probably be better off in a smaller place anyway. It was almost laughable, how out of touch he was. He thought I'd be lost, desperate, that I'd fall apart. But what he didn't know was that I wasn't just surviving. I was planning. Another text came through. I'll need you to take care of the finances. I'm moving on with my life. You'll be fine. I could almost hear his smug tone as I read it. You'll be fine. Wasn't that rich? The same man who'd emptied our joint account without a second thought, now telling me I'd be fine? As if he hadn't just used our shared funds to pay for a life with someone else. I wasn't going to beg him for an explanation. I wasn't going to cry or scream. I didn't need to. I had already built my own safety net. I had a business that was thriving, something he'd always mocked and belittled as my little shop. That little shop was now my strength. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Mark. I've already told my family. They agree we've grown apart. It's nobody's fault. Nobody's fault? Really? He could pretend all he wanted, but I knew the truth. I smiled, shaking my head. I wouldn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Instead, I went to work, focusing on my business. I had a reputation to maintain, and the shop had become a symbol of everything I'd fought for. The doors opened every day, customers came in, and they saw a successful woman who had built something real. Mark's world was falling apart, but mine? Mine was just beginning. The next day was like any other, busy, filled with customers, inventory, and the regular hum of running a successful boutique. But behind the scenes, everything had shifted. The texts from Mark continued, but I was no longer even reading them. I had more important things to focus on. My lawyer had called me first thing in the morning with an update. The emergency hearing is set for Monday, she said, her voice calm but firm. We've got everything in place. The fraud, the joint account, everything. I felt a small surge of satisfaction. Mark had made a critical mistake. He thought he could buy a house, drain our funds, and walk away without consequences. But he hadn't counted on my ability to plan ahead. The first sign of Mark's panic came just after lunch, when I noticed the phone buzzing more than usual. I checked. What did you do to our credit card? Came one text. The airline won't honor our tickets. The hotel canceled our reservation. I didn't even respond. Why bother? He thought I was just sitting around waiting for him to come back and fix things. But I wasn't. The damage was done. Instead, I made a few more calls. This time, I was on the phone with the credit card company. The representative was polite, but couldn't quite mask the satisfaction in her voice. Yes, Mrs. Harrison, I see here that the charges are indeed fraudulent. I'll cancel the tickets and issue a refund immediately. Mark was about to find out that his little Miami escape wasn't going to be as smooth as he'd imagined. His flights and hotel reservation were invalidated, and the money he'd drained from our account had started to come back to bite him. The day dragged on, but I wasn't concerned. Mark would try to reach out again, and he would be met with the same silence. He hadn't figured it out yet, but this wasn't just about the money, it was about the control. I wasn't letting him take that from me. By the time I was locking up the shop for the night, there was another text. Don't worry about the house. I'll let you stay there until you find something smaller. I couldn't help but laugh out loud. Did he really think he had any claim to the house? The house I had inherited from my grandmother? The house I had kept in my name despite his repeated attempts to add his name to the deed? I turned off my phone. That was when I realized just how badly he had underestimated me. He thought he was leaving me with nothing. He thought that by buying the house, draining the account, and running off with his younger upgrade, he could erase me. But what he didn't know was that I had planned for this moment. And now, I was ready. Later that evening, I pulled out the folder again. The one with the receipts, the account details, the hotel charges, everything. I added in the text messages too. Every arrogant message Mark had sent, every mockery, every bit of evidence he had unwittingly handed me. I wasn't going to fight him with emotion or anger. I was going to fight him with facts. Hard, indisputable facts. And I knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. The weekend came and went, but it felt like a lifetime. My lawyer had everything she needed. Monday morning arrived, and with it, a quiet certainty. Mark had no idea what he was about to face. I spent the day at the shop, checking in on orders and answering emails. But I knew everything was about to shift. I could feel the calm before the storm. Just before noon, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was from Mark's mother. "Claire," she said, her voice soft but tinged with frustration. "Mark told us everything. He said you've been cold, controlling, that you drove him away. I don't know what's going on, but I thought you'd want to know." I put her on speakerphone while I arranged a display of scarves. "Did he tell you he emptied our joint account?" I asked casually. "Or used our shared credit card to book flights and a hotel with his girlfriend?" There was silence on the other end. "Well, he did," I continued, keeping my voice steady. "And he also used our savings to buy a house for himself. I'm sure he left out those details, right?" Her voice cracked. "He said he was leaving you, that it was over, but he never mentioned that." I could hear her beginning to piece things together, the denial slipping away. I ended the conversation politely, explaining that my lawyer had advised minimal contact during the proceedings. There was no reason to drag out any more conversation. Mark had made his bed, and now he'd have to lie in it. I smiled, feeling a small sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about getting her to take sides, but about making sure Mark's family knew the truth. They would have to come to terms with his actions. I didn't need their support, not anymore. By the time I got back to my desk, another text came through. It was from Mark again, of course. "You'll be fine. The house is mine. I'll make sure you're not left with nothing, but you need to move on." This time, I didn't even read it. Instead, I forwarded it straight to my lawyer. Let him dig his hole deeper. The next few days were a blur of action. I received updates from my lawyer on the progress of the emergency hearing. The court had already set everything in motion. Based on his admission of fraud and the documented evidence of his financial misconduct, we were in a strong position to freeze his assets. Mark didn't know it yet, but his plans were falling apart faster than he could try to rewrite the narrative. I watched him spiral as the week went on. His text messages became more frequent, more frantic. Each one was another attempt to manipulate, or guilt me into backing down. But it was too late. He'd already gone too far. Another message popped up on my screen, this time with a new level of desperation. "I've been planning this for months. You know I was unhappy, don't you? I tried to make it work, but you just didn't get me. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I didn't even open it. Instead, I focused on the next step. I had everything ready. The house would be his downfall, not mine. All I needed was for him to make one more move, and he would give me the victory I was prepared for. And that victory? It wouldn't be about money. It would be about proving that he couldn't take everything from me. Not my business, not my home, and certainly not my dignity. By the time I walked into the courthouse on Monday, I was already 2 steps ahead of him. He was about to learn a hard lesson about underestimating me. The courtroom was cold, sterile, almost impersonal. But it felt like home to me. As I sat in the waiting area, I glanced around at the other people in the room, some hopeful, others defeated. But none of them were in my position. None of them had prepared as I had. I wasn't nervous. I knew I had the law on my side. I knew I had evidence, hard, undeniable proof. And I knew Mark's arrogance had already paved the way for his own defeat. My lawyer, who had been with me every step of the way, looked over her notes and gave me a quick nod as we walked into the courtroom. Mark was already there, standing next to his new lawyer. His smug smile disappeared the moment he saw me. He couldn't hide it, the panic in his eyes. I took a seat at the table, calm, collected. Mark's lawyer attempted a last-ditch effort to assert dominance, but it was clear that the tide had already turned. They knew it. I knew it. And most importantly, the judge knew it. Mark looked disheveled, as if the image he had been trying to project, successful, carefree, had begun to unravel. His new clothes, a desperate attempt to appear younger, seemed out of place in the cold, impersonal environment of the courtroom. The judge called the case, and we were on. "Mr. Harrison," the judge said, addressing Mark directly, "you have admitted to using the joint account for personal expenditures. You've used your shared credit card to fund trips with your girlfriend. Would you like to explain these actions?" Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I was just trying to move on," he muttered, barely looking at the judge. "It wasn't like I took everything. She'll be fine." The judge raised an eyebrow. "You emptied the joint account and then bought a house with funds you knew weren't solely yours. That doesn't sound like a fresh start. It sounds like financial misconduct." Mark's face flushed. He couldn't argue with the facts. He tried to keep his cool, but his arrogance had already started to dissolve. "My client," Mark's lawyer interjected, attempting to save face, "argues that Mrs. Harrison has been controlling, that she contributed to the breakdown of their marriage. This was an attempt to regain some control over his life." The judge turned to me. "Mrs. Harrison, do you have anything to say about these claims?" I stood, calm but resolute. "I've kept detailed records of every transaction, every withdrawal from our joint account. I've always maintained separate finances and protected my business. Mark may have thought I wouldn't notice, but I did. And I've been preparing for this moment." I pulled out a binder of documents, records of the account, the suspicious charges, the hotel receipts, the messages he had sent me. Every piece of evidence laid out in front of the judge, clear and irrefutable. His lawyer's face tightened as the judge flipped through the pages, his hands moving faster with each page. "And," I added, "I've also been taking steps to protect myself and my business, which Mark has always dismissed as a hobby. But this hobby now funds my future. I've worked hard for what I've built, and I'm not giving that up because of someone else's poor decisions." The judge nodded. "You've made your case. The evidence is clear." I could feel Mark's frustration rising. He started to fidget, glancing nervously at his lawyer, who had no answers, no defenses. All his bravado had turned into nothing more than a faint hope that somehow this would blow over. The judge looked back at him. "Mr. Harrison, this court finds sufficient evidence of financial misconduct. All shared assets are hereby frozen pending the dissolution of this marriage. Mr. Harrison is also ordered to return any funds removed from the joint account within 24 hours. Mark's face went white. "But—" The judge held up a hand, silencing him. "You will also be responsible for any other charges made on the shared credit card." Mark's lawyer tried to interject once more, but the judge wasn't having it. "The court has seen enough. You will return the funds, Mr. Harrison. I'll consider any further claims once that's done." Mark slumped back in his chair, defeated. The man who thought he could outsmart me, the man who believed he could control everything, was now facing the consequences of his actions. It was almost pitiful to watch. I didn't look back at him. I didn't need to. The next few days passed in a blur. The courtroom had sealed Mark's fate, but the reality of it was settling in. His victory was gone. His smugness had evaporated, and in its place was desperation. He started reaching out again, his messages now a mix of pleading and anger. "What have you done to me? You'll regret this. I'll make sure everyone knows how you've manipulated everything." I didn't respond. Each message I received, I forwarded it to my lawyer. Every little outburst was another piece of evidence, another part of the puzzle that was working against him. He was digging his own grave. Mark had no idea what kind of game he was playing. He thought he was winning, but all I had to do was sit back and watch him unravel. As far as I was concerned, the battle wasn't over, but I had already won. My business was protected, my assets were secure, and the judge had seen through his lies. Meanwhile, life at the shop went on. Business was booming. Customers had heard about the divorce, and many of them came in just to offer support. They'd leave with bags full of merchandise, more than they'd intended to buy. It felt good, knowing that my hard work was paying off, despite everything. But Mark, he was spiraling. I'd heard rumors, whispers about his situation. He was staying at a budget hotel, trying to cover up his financial mess with a few half-hearted attempts at repairing his life. I heard he'd tried to get a personal loan to cover some of his debts, but no one was willing to help him. The picture he had once painted of a smooth escape was quickly turning into a nightmare. I kept moving forward, focused on what mattered. The boutique was thriving, and now there was talk of expanding. I wasn't going to waste time worrying about Mark. His world was collapsing, but mine was only getting stronger. Late one afternoon, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from my lawyer. I just got an update. Mark's lawyer filed a petition to revisit the settlement. "He's claiming the division was unfair," she said, a touch of disbelief in her voice. I laughed, shaking my head. Unfair? His own messages say it all. He admitted to the fraud. He'll get nowhere. "Well, the judge didn't think much of it either," my lawyer replied. "The petition was dismissed almost immediately. I've also received notice that Mark's attempting to get his job back at his old company." I could almost hear the smirk in her voice. "He's been talking about getting his life back together, but word is, the HR department's been investigating his behavior." I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. Mark was trying so hard to put everything back together, but the cracks were showing. His attempts to appear like the carefree guy he'd been before were now transparent. He had nowhere to go. But that wasn't my problem anymore. My business was flourishing. I was getting recognition for it. And the fact that Mark was still trying to claim credit for my work, to manipulate people into thinking he had been part of it all along, just made me laugh. I was the one who had built this, not him. It had been a few weeks since the hearing, and things had settled into a new rhythm. The shop was busier than ever, word of my success spreading across town. I'd secured another contract with a high-end designer, and I was already planning the launch of a second location. Mark's name had long faded from my thoughts, replaced with the steady hum of progress and ambition. But then, I got a call from my lawyer. She sounded more amused than anything else. "I just thought you'd like to know," she said. "Mark filed another petition to revisit the settlement. He's still claiming that you got a disproportionate share of the assets." I sat back in my chair, a smile tugging at my lips. Did he really? Oh, yes. He's still holding on to the idea that the boutique was his idea all along. He even went as far as to suggest he'd invested in it early on. I laughed, shaking my head. "That's rich. He's still trying to rewrite history?" "He's trying," my lawyer replied. "But this time the judge is having none of it. They're even adding this latest petition to his file so I wouldn't be too worried." I wasn't worried. The truth was, every move Mark made was just making his case weaker. His desperation was palpable, and each attempt to revise the narrative only solidified my position. My meticulous records, the documentation of every suspicious transaction, and the undeniable evidence of his financial misconduct had given me the upper hand from the start. A few days later, I ran into Mark's mother at the grocery store. She looked flustered, her usual composed demeanor gone. "I don't know what to do anymore," she said, her voice wavering. "Mark's trying to blame everyone. Melissa, you, even his boss, for what's happening to him. He doesn't get it. He keeps saying you were the one who ruined everything." I paused, then asked calmly, "Has he mentioned that he used our joint account to buy a house? Or charged a flight for his trip with Melissa?" Her face flushed. She hadn't heard that part of the story before. "No, he didn't mention that." I sighed. I didn't think so. "Claire," she said, her voice thick with guilt. "He's always been selfish. But we didn't know. We didn't understand how much you were doing for yourself." "I know," I replied, my voice steady. "It's too late for apologies now." I turned to walk away but stopped and glanced back at her. "Just so you know, Mark's still trying to claim my business, but I'm not letting him take it." Her expression softened, and I could see the regret in her eyes. I never thought he'd go this far. I didn't say anything more. I didn't need to. I wasn't in the business of convincing people of the truth anymore. The only thing that mattered now was my future, and the future I was building without him. By the end of the week, another email came in. The final ruling from the court. Mark's claims about the business were dismissed. The assets were final, and I was awarded full ownership of the boutique, the house, and everything I'd worked so hard for. I read it once, then closed the email with a quiet satisfaction. This chapter of my life was over, and Mark had made his final mistake. As I sat at my desk, sipping my coffee, I thought back to the beginning of all of this, to that moment when I first discovered what he had done, when I could have let the anger take over, let the betrayal define me. But instead, I'd made a choice. I chose to play the long game, and in the end, that was what had made all the difference. Months passed since the court's final decision, and things had shifted in a way I hadn't anticipated. The boutique was thriving beyond my expectations. Word had gotten out about my story, and it wasn't just my divorce that people were talking about. It was my success. Mark, on the other hand, had dug himself deeper into his hole. I'd heard from mutual acquaintances that he was living with his parents again, the apartment he had planned on moving into a distant dream. His job had taken a nosedive, too. His position at the company had been eliminated after the HR investigation, and he'd been scrambling ever since. Word on the street was that he'd tried to enter some get-rich-quick schemes, but nothing was working. Meanwhile, I had opened a second location for the boutique. The online store was growing steadily, and I was already getting offers from local magazines for features. My business was no longer just a small shop. It was becoming a brand, and I was the one who had built it. One afternoon, I received an unexpected visit at the shop. Melissa. Yes, that Melissa, the one Mark had run off with. She walked in, looking a little different than the last time I saw her. Younger, perhaps, but also more mature. She looked nervous, clutching her purse tightly. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice soft. I was surprised, but I didn't show it. "For what?" "For everything," she said. "I was so blinded by everything he said. I thought you were the problem, that you were holding him back. But I get it now. I see what he was really doing. He was using me just like he used you. And I wanted to say, I'm sorry." I studied her for a moment, thinking about how far I had come. And despite everything, despite how she was a part of the mess I had found myself in, I couldn't bring myself to feel angry. "It's not about you," I said finally. "It's about learning to trust myself, and learning that there's no such thing as a fresh start when you're running away from your own mess. You don't need to apologize to me, but you might want to rethink what you're building with him." She nodded, her face reddening. "I learned that lesson the hard way. Believe me, I won't make the same mistake again." I smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile of relief, knowing I had grown from this. I had built something real, and I wasn't going to let anyone, Mark included, take that from me. We talked for a few more minutes, mostly about her new career plans and the lessons we had learned. She'd gone back to school and was starting a consulting business of her own. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first walked into my life. As she left, I thought about how far I'd come, not just financially, but emotionally. Mark had thought that his cruelty, his betrayal, would break me. Instead, it had made me stronger. Later that week, I got an email from a local magazine wanting to feature my story. They didn't want to focus on the divorce or the hardship. They wanted to talk about how I turned a small boutique into a thriving business. They wanted to tell the story of resilience, of a woman who didn't let anyone, or anything, hold her back. I knew exactly what to say. "Success," I wrote back, "is the best revenge." I attached a photo of my latest award for my business, then walked out of the office. The world outside was bright, and for the first time in a long time, I knew I had everything I needed to keep moving forward. As I locked the door behind me, I thought back to that text Mark had sent me months ago. "Have fun with your little shop. At least it'll keep you busy in your old age." I framed it, placed it on my desk as a reminder of where I'd started and how far I'd come. And below it, I put a simple note: "Success is the best revenge."